2 Corinthians chapter 1. Second Corinthians chapter 1. Are we streaming? Is sound coming out? I'm not muted. Awesome. All right, 2 Corinthians chapter 1. We'll look at verses 5 through 7 this evening. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, starting at verse number 5. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also aboundeth by Christ. I'm going to stop there because verses 6 and 7 are results of verse number 5. And so I'm going to do most of my preaching in verse number 5. And then we're going to look at verses 6 and 7 kind of as this is what that means, this is what that means. Or because of verse number 5, this is what happens in verse 6. Because of verse number 5, this is what happens in verse number 7. Kind of thing. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us. Now, what were the sufferings of Christ? Basically, from birth. I want to illustrate that, and I've mentioned this before, but I want to read the verses to you. So in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse number 1, go there. Hold your places here and go to Isaiah chapter 6 and verse number 1. Now, this should be a well-known passage, but it also just in words illustrate where Christ came from when he left heaven and he came to earth as a babe. And we'll start his sufferings at conception. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse number 1, in the year that Uzziah died, or King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon his throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another, and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. And the post of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. So we see perpetual worship going on in the throne room. And there is no sin presence there. And the smoke is the smoke of the glory of God. And so the sufferings of Christ start at his conception. And when he's born into this world. The world that he cursed back in Genesis. And so everything about him being here, having to be submitted to Joseph and Mary. I mean, how hard is that? The one that created the family now has to submit to mom and dad, who really aren't mom and dad, because he had no beginning. But he submitted himself. And then as he grows up, we have the scribes and the Pharisees questioning him all the time. Created beings that he created questioning the Creator. And he put up with that. But before that happens, there was that 40-day period, 40 days and 40 nights, where he suffered without eating. He fasted and prayed. And then he was tempted of the devil. So after, as a man, after suffering as a man, fasting, I have water.
You have water?
Yeah, I'm looking for a cough drop. I was hoping that I dropped. Do you have one?
Sure.
That would be great. He suffered as a man 100%. After 40, really for me, after like 40 hours, I'd be dead. After 40 hours, I'd be dead. But the Lord went through 40 days of fasting. Thank you, David. This is the exact same kind that I used. So when we talk about the sufferings of Christ, we're not just talking about when he went to the cross, that false trial, getting the beatings, getting his beard plucked out, getting smote on his face, getting spitted in, has his face spit on, the crown of thorns plated on his head. We're not just talking about those sufferings. We're talking about having to put up with creation. Because where was he? He was in the throne room, wasn't he? So when we talk about as the sufferings of Christ, as those sufferings of Christ abound in us. Now, who's the us here? Who's the us specifically here in this verse? Paul, Silas, Luke. It's his team. We were talking about this morning, his team. That's who the us is here in this verse. The us that Art was talking about is down a little bit later. Paul is speaking to the church at Corinth, and he says, "For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also aboundeth by Christ." So again, where would we get consolation, or where did Paul get consolation for him suffering as Christ suffered? Where did Paul get that consolation from? The healing, the comforting, the soothing. Where did Paul get it from? From Christ. That's what he says here. So our conversation also aboundeth by Christ. That's his soothing. That's where Paul got it from. The writer in the commentary, one of the commentaries I was reading, the more we share Christ's suffering, the more we're able to give of his comfort. And that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying, I suffer as Christ suffered, and we talked a little bit about how Christ suffered. Did Paul suffer any? You know, we kind of talked about a little bit of it this morning. He got kicked out of a city. Now, that's all they did to him in Thessalonica, was they just kicked him out. But in other cities, didn't they stone him and leave him for dead? Hit him with rods. They've beaten him several times. He's been thrown in jail. We talked about the Philippian jailer last week or a couple weeks ago. Shipwrecked in the deep, what is it, a day and a night. I remember the one where he told the shipmaster, "Don't leave out of this port or this ship is going to be lost, but everybody will be left alive, but the ship is going to be lost." And the shipmaster listened to the Roman soldier instead of to Paul. Paul, who was speaking to the one who's omniscient. I told you. How long did they fight that shipwreck or the weather before the ship actually grounded? Wasn't it, 2 weeks or something like that? And finally Paul said, "Hey guys, eat, because tonight is going to be the night." And they strengthened themselves and they cast things off the boat, lightened the boat. They threw the anchors down and lost half of the ship. But all of the people were saved. So Paul also suffered by being the smartest guy in the room, but nobody would ever listen to him. I know how that feels. That was a joke. I know how that feels. So Paul suffered with Christ's suffering. And the more we share Christ's suffering, or the more Paul shares Christ's suffering, the more he was able to give of Christ's comfort. Because how is Paul going to share Christ's comfort to everybody else? So our consolation also aboundeth by Christ. Paul experienced the consolation of Christ. Therefore, Paul can share the consolation of Christ with others who are going through the same thing. I want you to look in Matthew chapter 20 with me real quick. And we're going to take just kind of a slight turn, but we're still on topic here. Is the Christian life described as roses without the thorns? Is it described as, like some people describe it, the prosperity gospel? You name it, you claim it. Everything's going to be good. If something goes wrong in your life, it's because you lack a little bit of faith. But there's that whole philosophy that once you get saved, everything's going to be perfect. Or is the Christian life going to be the thorns without the roses? No bed. I mean, we are promised shelter. If you put the kingdom of God first, all these things should be added to you. There's like shelter, clothing, raiment, food, the necessities of life. That's the only thing we're promised. Now, is it going to be your favorite? Rocky Road ice cream all the time? And it doesn't hurt your hips or your blood sugar or anything like that? Locust and honey. It's a favorite. Just like cherry's a favorite. So having all that in mind, here's what the Lord has to say about how the Christian life is going to be in Matthew chapter 20 and starting in verse 20. I'm starting back that far to get context. We'll go down to verse 23. That'll be the main verse. Then came to him the mother of Zebedee's children with her sons, worshiping him and desiring a certain thing of him. And he said unto her, What wilt thou? And she saith unto him, Grant that these my two sons may sit, the one on thy right hand and the other on thy left hand in thy kingdom. But Jesus answered and said, You know not what you ask. Are you able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they said, We are able. And he saith, verse 23, And he saith unto them, Ye shall drink indeed of my cup, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. You are going to have the same sufferings that I had. You are going to be persecuted for your faith. You are going to be persecuted because you're a follower of me, and they persecuted me. And then, of course, he goes on and, and answers the question. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared of my Father. And so we're not promised a rosy life. We're not promised an easy life. It's not going to be perfect after you get saved. There's going to be trials. There's going to be sufferings because you're a follower of Christ. You are going to be ridiculed. You might be turned down for a promotion. You might be turned down for a job because you're a Christian. While you're going through that, you're also going to be comforted of Jesus Christ. I love how he just comes in and takes care of the matter. I love that. You guys know I worked at Lowe's, and it was getting really bad. My health was getting really bad. My stress level was really high. My body just couldn't take it anymore. And, I wasn't suffering for Christ in that, but I sure was suffering. And the Lord just came along with another job to just took all that away. I'm driving around an air-conditioned truck. I'm not on my feet all day. I'm not lifting up heavy toilets, heavy vanities. I'm not having to deal with customers until I come here. Then I have to deal with people. You're not customers, I have to deal with people. But the Lord just swoops in and He takes care of things. He comforts us while we're in a trial. He consoles us. And now we come down to verses 6 and 7. Now He's pointing it to the church. And whether we be afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation. He's applying it to Himself now. He's moving from Jesus comforting Him to Him now comforting the church. Whether we be afflicted, again, that's Paul, it is for your consolation and salvation. All the suffering that Paul goes through, all those things that he talks about in the perils of the deep, and the perils of men, and the perils of his countrymen, and the perils in the wilderness, the perils of here, the perils of there, and so on and so forth. He suffers all of that so that he can see those people saved. That's half of it. But then when those people are going through certain trials and tribulations, He's able to comfort them as Christ comforted him. The verse goes on, which is effectual in the enduring of the same sufferings which we also suffer, or whether we be comforted, it is for your consolation and salvation. So Paul's just saying it again. And by the way, I'm surprised he didn't put in there gladly. Paul would gladly suffer beatings and stonings and imprisonment and time in the deep and all of that, getting kicked out of cities, if people would get saved. And that's the testimony that we see, don't we? We just talked about Thessalonica this morning. Multitudes got saved, and Paul was only there 3 Sabbath days. Just think what would have happened if he could have been there a little bit longer. And so Paul is able to comfort the way that Christ comforted him. Now verse number 7. And our hope of you is steadfast, knowing that as ye are partakers of the suffering, so shall ye be also of the consolation. And we mentioned this here recently as well. You know why God puts us through trials? Sometimes it's to temper us, sometimes it's to mature us, but sometimes it's to put us through the trial so that we can help somebody that comes along down the road. There's some things I've been through in my life that I don't know why I had to go through it, but then later on, somebody came along who's going through the same thing, and you know what I was able to do? Help them out, console them, comfort them. And the Lord does that with all of us. He'll put you through a situation so you can help somebody else. Now, whether you recognize that or not, is a whole other matter. But, God put you in a situation, and so you could help somebody else coming down the road with that comfort that you got. And so that's what verse 7 is talking about. And our hope of you is steadfast, knowing that as ye are partakers of the suffering, the ye there now would be what Art was talking about, us as the church. Ye are partakers of the sufferings, so shall ye be also of the consolation. You should be able to comfort. You should be able to learn what Christ has given to you, and then you should be able to help somebody else. Even if it's just coming alongside. Coming alongside. You guys remember that word from last week or the week before? Which is translated usually in the scriptures as? The word that's, say it again? Nope. You're close. What's the Holy Spirit known as? The Comforter. The comer alongsider. That's what that word translated is. The word comforter has that idea of coming alongside somebody. And so you would in turn be the comforter for that person who's suffering because you have gone through it. There are some people that have gone through some things that I'm not really going to be able to understand because I've not gone through it. But you may have gone through it, and you'll be the best choice to be the comer alongsider, the comforter, to help that person. And so that's what Paul is talking about in these 3 verses. He's trying to show us that Christ suffered, Paul suffered, and was consoled by Christ. Paul is showing consolation to the people he runs into, and now when we come into trials and things like that, there's people that can come and come alongside us, or we can go alongside them and comfort. And like I said, this has been a theme in several of our messages. So somebody here needs to get a hold of that. Somebody here needs to get a hold of that. You need to be a comforter. You've been comforted. You need to be a comforter. And here's the reason why. Christ suffered, Paul suffered, you're suffering. Paul was consoled by Christ. Paul has consoled others. Those have consoled us, and we should console others. And like I said, and this is a smaller group, so somebody needs to get a hold of this lesson and be a comforter. Not a wet blanket, but a comforter. All right, questions or comments about these 3 verses?